Wendy Hisco. I'm the library director here at Brownell, and I'm happy to see everybody here tonight. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for this evening. It's Elizabeth Morrison is an associate professor of religion at Middlebury College, where she has taught since 2003. Her research focuses on pre-modern Chinese Buddhist history, especially the history of Chan Zen tradition, but her teaching interests also include religion through East Asia, Buddhist monastic culture, religion in contemporary China, Buddhism in the modern world, including the West. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Morrison.
Thank you, Wendy. I want to start by explaining my interest in this topic. And that is to say, as the introduction made clear, I'm actually a scholar of Chinese Buddhism, medieval Chinese Buddhism. So for example, the project I'm working on right now is a translation of a 12th century essay by a Buddhist layman who's defending Buddhism against Confucian critics. So I spend a lot of my time with classical Chinese and very far in the past, but I'm also really interested in Buddhism in the West. Number one, because I live here and now, and so do my students. But secondly, the adaptation of Buddhism to China and vice versa, Buddhism to China and China to Buddhism, is one of my long-standing fascinations. How did China accept Buddhism? How did it change it? And I think that the spread of Buddhism to the West is a parallel phenomenon. And this is something I'll come back to briefly at the end of the talk. What's exciting is that rather than being limited to the sources that I have for the 11th and 12th centuries in China, although Buddhism was introduced much earlier, here I feel like this is unfolding before my eyes, and it's very interesting and exciting. So for that reason, I keep up to date with the scholarship on Buddhism in the West, and I also have my own observations, and I can warn you in advance, at least one of them turns into a rant, a small rant. So tonight I'm going to start with the figure of Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and writer. And I'm going to use his encounter with Buddhism to make some comments about the reception and adaptation of Buddhism in the West. And once I've talked about Merton, I'll then go on to describe a number of characteristics that I see in the adaptation of Buddhism to the West, or the spread of the Buddhist tradition to the West, that we don't find in Merton's life but are out there. And not all of these characteristics appear in the same place at the same time, but we can find all of them. So to start with Thomas Merton, he was born in 1915, and despite having been born into a family that was not religiously affiliated to any great extent, his extended family was connected both to the Church of England and distantly to the Quaker movement. Despite growing up without much religious background, in his early 20s, he became a practicing Catholic. In his late 20s, he began his life in the order of the Cistercians of the strict observance. There are different kinds of Cistercians, and he's the kind that's the strict observance, also known as the Trappists. They're known as the Trappists because of the sort of mother monastery in France, which is the Abbey of La Grande Trappe. And Merton became a Trappist and entered the Abbey, the Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. And here, let me just show you. This is what it looks like now. Big, beautiful Roman establishment in just outside Louisville, Kentucky. And this is not the first room he had there, but later on, this was his hermitage room. As is common in some Roman Catholic orders, he was also ordained as a priest some years later. So he's both a monk and a priest. While living at Gethsemane, he wrote an autobiography called The Seven-Story Mountain. First edition came out in 1948, and I just went down and found on their shelves an edition that came out in the 70s. It has never been out of print. He was still quite a young man when this came out, and it has attracted, from the 40s on, a considerable amount of attention from people both within and beyond the Catholic community. It, in fact, became a bestseller in 1948 when it first came out. And there's actually a great story connected to that where it was doing really well. It was selling lots of copies, but the New York Times had a rule against listing religious books. So they went back and forth with the publisher until they finally agreed to list it on the bestseller list. Because just in terms of numbers, it was selling a tremendous amount. As I said, it's still in print. It's been published into many languages, and Evelyn Waugh has a comment on here, you don't see blurbs on the front of a book very often, but may well prove to be of permanent interest in the history of religious experience. It's not yet been 100 years, but thus far Evelyn Waugh's prediction has been coming true. Merton went on to produce a steady stream of writings, including books about interfaith dialogue and Asian religious traditions. In 1968, he was finally able to make his first long-awaited, long-anticipated trip to Asia. But a few months into the trip, after meeting a number of important Buddhist figures and other religious leaders, he died at the age of 53 in Bangkok. So today what I want to take on is, what do we make of Merton's encounter with the Buddhist tradition, and how is it representative of Western encounters with Buddhism more broadly? I want to take on 4 issues through this. First is Buddhism as a corrective to Western problems. The second is a focus on experience and meditation. The third, exposure to multiple Buddhist traditions. And fourth, the vexing problem of identity. So the very first thing I want to take on is the idea that Buddhism often serves as a corrective to Western problems. Why was Merton reading Buddhism? Why was he seeking out Buddhist teachers? Well, first of all, he wasn't just seeking out Buddhists. He seems to have been quite curious about a number of different religious traditions. He was very impressed with the Muslim mystical tradition called Sufism. He was very interested in early Taoist thought. And in fact, these curiosities about a variety of religious traditions predate his conversion to Catholicism. If you've read The Seven-Story Mountain, you know there's a famous episode in it in which he seeks out a meeting with a Hindu teacher. And I've got some wonderful pictures of this guy, Mahanambratra Brahmachari. So a celibate Hindu monk in the Vaishnavite, the Vishnu-worshipping tradition. This guy astonishingly got a PhD at the University of Chicago in the late 30s and lived a very, very long life as a Hindu leader. Merton went to meet him. He was a young man, just in his early 20s, and this man said to him, "You have a beautiful, rich tradition here in the West. Pursue that. Be the best Christian you can be. You don't need to convert to anything else." So this is an interesting moment, but what's even better is that having just finished his PhD at the University of Chicago, this guy also had some reading suggestions. He said, "Have you read St. Augustine?" He hadn't. "Go read the Confessions," he said. "Have you read Thomas à Kempis?" "No? Well, you ought to go read Imitation of Christ." So a very well-educated Hindu with both a traditional Hindu education, but also a Western education in religious studies, was the one telling him, turn back to this tradition. It may not be yours in terms of your family, but it's yours in terms of your culture. So you should turn back to that first. There's also a wonderful story that this particular figure, he wore his traditional robes, but when he came to the West, he discovered Keds. And he always wore Keds with his robes. They were so comfortable. Now, that redirection back to Christianity helped lead to Merton's conversion to Catholicism and eventually his monastic vocation. But he continued to be really interested in other religious traditions, especially their mystical dimensions. And it's clear that he, like many others in mid-20th century US, turned to mystics both in the monotheistic traditions and elsewhere. Attention to non-Western, non-Abrahamic religion was understood by Merton and many others as a corrective to the problems of the modern West, namely over-intellectualization, materialism, industrialization, secularism, alienation. in a book that he wrote, that he published in the 50s, and this is really the only giant chunk of text that I'll throw at you tonight, but it's quite wonderful, and I wanted to be able to have you look at it as well as have me read it. So this is a book called Thoughts in Solitude that he published in the 50s after The Seven-Storey Mountain, and he wrote that the murderous din of our materialism cannot be allowed to silence the independent voices which will never cease to speak, whether they be voices of Christian saints, or voices of Oriental sages like Lao Tzu or the Zen masters, or voices like Thoreau or Martin Buber or Max Picard. It is all very well to insist that man is a social animal. That fact is obvious enough, but that is no justification for making him a mere cog for a totalitarian machine, or in a religious one for that matter. No amount of technological progress will cure the hatred that eats away at the vitals of materialistic society like a spiritual cancer. The only cure is, and must always be, spiritual. In other words, Merton did not see a political or social solution to the problems of the modern industrialized West. He saw the spiritual as foundational, and he was willing to look beyond the Catholic Church for inspiration and for fellowship. His timing was also excellent because the church was not discouraging him at that moment. In 1965, and this is really just the official statement from the church, but this had been bubbling up already in the 50s. A statement comes out under Pope Paul VI. The church, therefore, has this exhortation for her sons: prudently and lovingly, through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, and in witness of Christian faith and life, acknowledge, preserve, and promote the spiritual and moral goods found among these men, as well as the values in their society and cultures. So, thanks to advice from a Hindu teacher, Merton discovered the contemplative and mystical Christian tradition, and other Westerners, both Christian and Jewish, have in recent decades also rediscovered these elements of their traditions. Nevertheless, Merton and many other Westerners that I encounter, well, actually Merton doesn't do this, but many people seem to divide the world into West and to East, and they describe the West as rational and unspiritual, and the quote-unquote East as mystical and somehow in touch with the truth. And this is where my rant comes in. The very idea of the East, of Asia as a single monolith, with a single characteristic, is one of the biggest obstacles I face in my teaching. And I delight when I can convince my students that India and China are very different, that we should give up this word, the East. It is not helpful. It also leaves out a whole lot of the world. If we just think about the world as East and West, there are a whole lot of people we're ignoring. Also, what I find is that we often mischaracterize this divide between East and West because it comes out of ignorance about the past in the West. So that what people do is they read modern qualities into the West, and they see the East, so-called East, as pre-modern, when actually I think the divide between pre-modern and modern is the stark one. And for what it's worth, I still think that this idea that the East can somehow be corrective for the ills of the West, it's still really around. I see it commonly, especially not just with religion and spirituality, but also with health, which is connected. I'm not saying that there aren't valuable things to be found in other cultures, but sometimes mistakes, I think, get made there. And one of the ways I can help explain that from the other side is that I spend some time in China, and what happens in China is that people look to the West to solve their problems. So nowadays, Protestant Christianity is doing extremely well in mainland China. It's growing rapidly. Well, it may be, it's big. It's big. It's really grown a lot. And when you talk to people, sometimes what you find out is that they're not just responding to the actual message of Christianity, but they're taking Christianity as part of a package deal. You know, it's Western, so you've got Christianity, goes hand in hand with democracy, goes hand in hand with capitalism, comes hand in hand with science. And of course, we know, if we know the history of the West, that these things have very complicated histories, right? These democracy and capitalism and these things don't, and science don't have easy relationships with Christianity. They may have arrived at some excellent solutions and accommodations, but it's this idea of a package deal. So I think it's very common, it's a very human thing to look to others to sometimes have solutions for us, but
Do you accept questions now? Or?
I would prefer to wait, because otherwise I can never make it through the whole argument. I am timing it though. No, because I know very well that once we get started talking, then I'll just be like, well, I had told you I'd make 7 points, but we're done at 2. So do your best to just hold on. It's a mental practice to try and hold on to your questions at this point. So back to my list, and not all of them take the equal amounts of time, but number 2 is this question of meditation and experience. Merton had tremendous interest in silence and contemplation. And that can help us understand another common feature of the Western encounter with Buddhism, and that is a widespread interest in meditation. Now, I need to say, and I think probably almost everybody here knows this, but I'm just going to go ahead and say the obvious. Buddhism is not singular. It does not come in one flavor. It is a vast tradition with a great deal of internal diversity. Running through that diversity, however, there is an assumption that meditation is the practice which is necessary for attaining awakening. Different forms of Buddhism teach different forms of meditation, but it's a Buddhist fundamental that one cannot arrive at liberating truth, liberating knowledge without the practice of contemplation, either in this life or in future lives. That said, until very recently, relatively few Buddhists practiced meditation. It was a practice that was meant for the monks and the nuns. It was an elite practice. And most people didn't do it. They instead did other things that they hoped would prepare them to, in a future life, be a monk or a nun who could practice meditation. So until quite recently, it's really been reserved for the serious full-time practitioners. And even within monastic communities, not everybody focuses on meditation at all times. Some monks and nuns are scholars. Some monks and nuns are administrators. Some of them are fundraisers. Some people do devotional practice. So most of the time, most Buddhists are not meditating. They may be preparing to spend lifetimes devoted to meditation, but they're not doing it yet. In the West, however, most people come to Buddhism precisely not everybody, but most people come to it precisely because of an interest in contemplation and meditation, and Merton was around them. Now, his interest in contemplative practice and his desire to get to know Buddhist monks who were devoting themselves to it, albeit in a very different context, isn't surprising because, I mean, he'd become a Trappist monk, so it's not surprising in him. One of my questions, though, is why would so many other people be interested in it, people who aren't leaving what Buddhists call the household life? And I want to suggest that scholars of American religion and religion in the modern West have identified a possible reason. They say that especially in the US, in the West generally, but especially in the US, there's this striking emphasis starting in the 19th century on experience, personal experience as a source of religious authority. And they look to some things that might be very surprising in a lecture about what I'm talking about today. And that is, they talk about tent revivals in the mid-19th century, what's known as the Second Great Awakening, because these experiences, these big tent revivals, or in this case sometimes called a camp meeting, they were meant to bring people to a different emotional, spiritual state. And people sought that out to sort of revitalize their Christianity. At the same time, we also have the flourishing of spiritualism, also based on experiencing, somehow connecting with an invisible world. Now, I'll limit myself to, there are a lot of things going on here, but I want to add to this idea that this desire for experience is partly, I really think it partly has to do with a very American rejection of traditional authority, that Americans kind of want to be certain about what they're getting into. They want to have some firm, if evidence is maybe the wrong word, but some firm experience, something that they feel they're not just relying on others to tell them what's what. And I think that alongside the tent revivals of the Second Great Awakening and alongside the spiritualism, I think we can also see the rise in modern science, that people begin to want something that's at least quasi-empirical, right? That they can really say, well, I've experienced this, or I've seen it. So I think we've got this very American suspicion of institutions and leaders. And all I can say is I think about what I live in Cornwall, which is a small town next to Middlebury, and I just sit there and wait at town meeting every year. I just wait for my fellow citizens to stand up and say, as they have for a couple years running now, well, let's just wait and see how that marijuana legalization thing is working out in Colorado. We don't need to rush. Let people do some studies, right? Like, we want something empirical. We're not going to argue about this just from principles of liberty. Let's actually run the experiment, see what happens, and then we'll make a decision. And I sort of think that part of what we see in the great attraction of meditation is that people want to practice religion in a way that doesn't leave them reliant on the say-so of someone else. That dovetails very neatly with the Buddhist tradition, because the Buddha himself very famously says, I don't trust traditional authority. And he also says, don't take me on faith, right? I've done something, I invite you to do the same. I've blazed the trail, follow the trail after me. But you have to do it yourself, not just take what he says on faith. And he very certainly rejected most of the conventional wisdom of his day. So back to my list, we're on to number 3. Encounters with multiple traditions. Now, like with many other religions that have spread really widely, the Buddhist tradition is really a collection of many different related traditions, and these many different strains or types of Buddhism have arrived in the US through every kind of contact. Immigration, teachers coming from Asia, books, travel to Asia. So that all these different kinds of Buddhism are arriving in the US. One place that you can see I think is very sort of adorable, actually, is that there's a fairly well-known American Buddhist magazine called Tricycle. Some of you may have seen it. So Tricycle, that name it's got 2 connotations. One is that American Buddhism is really young. So American Buddhists are like toddlers, and they need a tricycle. But the other meaning is that within Buddhism, people talk about 3 different turnings of the Dharma, 3 different preachings. So these are the 3 major movements within Buddhism that are referred to as wheels. So the tricycle is built on all 3 turnings of the Dharma, right? So built into that American Buddhist magazine is this understanding that multiple traditions are present. This is not true in Asia, where these are all mostly separated out into different languages, different locations. So in the case of Merton, like many Americans who don't have any family connection to Buddhism, he first encountered the Zen tradition, Zen being the Japanese elaboration of a Chinese school that claims to go all the way back to the Buddha himself in India. It started to attract mainstream interest in the US starting in the 1950s. And very much along these lines, Merton began to read about Zen. He started corresponding. Sorry, we have to back up. I forgot to talk about an experience that Merton had. This is a quick one, but so Merton had a number of kind of overwhelming epiphanies in his life. One of them is described here. And the amazing thing is he had it on the street in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, and they put up a plaque. So they don't get, but here's what later when he wrote about it in his diary, but then he kind of polished it up, and this is what ends up in what he published. I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers, and if only everybody could realize this. But it cannot be explained. There's no way of telling people that they're all walking around shining like the sun, right? This beautiful experience of connectedness to others, and then we get this lovely plaque. Anyway, sorry, I forgot that I had put that in there to show. But back to Zen. So Merton started corresponding with this guy named D.T. Suzuki, a popularizer of Zen. Suzuki is quite a bit older. They didn't meet until the 60s. So Merton was around 50. And Suzuki was already 70 or so, close to 70. And he was really inspired by Zen art, Zen poetry, and so on. But he also corresponded with a prominent writer and translator in a different tradition, that is to say the Theravada tradition of South Asia. This guy is really interesting. They never met, but they corresponded. Nyaponika Thera As you can tell by looking at him, maybe he actually was German originally. German Jewish guy who got really interested in Buddhism, ended up converting, ended up leaving. The amazing story is he left Germany in the 1930s for Sri Lanka, became a monk, realized he needed to get his mother safely out of Germany, got his mother to Austria, thought he was fine. Nope, had to come back, get his mother, got his mother out of Austria, brought her to Sri Lanka with him. But he became a very important translator, and he and Merton corresponded. Thomas Merton also knew Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh sought him out, went all the way to Kentucky to Gethsemane to meet him in the mid-60s. And on his trip to Asia in 1968, Merton met a number of Tibetan teachers. He famously met the Dalai Lama, looking so astonishingly young, right? He was in his early 30s at that point, and also a number of other lamas who really impressed him. So he basically encountered every major branch of Buddhism, maybe not every particular kind, but most branches. And before he died, he'd actually made plans to go to Japan and practice Zen there. And he talked about doing a meditation retreat with a particular Tibetan teacher. Now, because of his death, we can't know what would have happened next. We don't know what would have happened if he'd actually had the chance to go to Japan or go on a retreat led by a Tibetan teacher. But his interest in talking to all these different people and drawing from them what he can is typical of the Western encounter with Buddhism in that it takes advantage of the whole wide range of Buddhist tradition. And what I see happening in the US is that some practitioners, they find a Buddhist teacher or community or principle or practice, and they just develop an exclusive sense of commitment to it, and that's just what they do. Others freely involve themselves with a multiplicity of Buddhist traditions, and sometimes, of course, many traditions, not just Buddhist. There's a scholar named Jeff Wilson who published a book a few years ago with this astonishing title. Oops, I forgot to show you. Sorry, I'm doing a bad job with my slides. The Dalai Lama actually did end up going to Gethsemane to visit Merton's grave very recently. And this is a kind of, I thought, touching photo of him meditating at his grave. And those of you who are familiar with Tibetan Buddhism will see what he's done with the grave marker. He's brought the white scarf, right, to show respect. So back to Jeff Wilson's book, Dixie Dharma. This is an ethnographic study of a Buddhist center in Richmond, Virginia, just down the road from the Confederate Memorial. And in it, there is a single building where several different Buddhist groups share a building. This is highly unusual, but this captures something really interesting, I think, about American Buddhism. So Wilson says, this would never happen in Asia. There's no place in Asia where you'd have Japanese Buddhism, different kinds of Tibetan Buddhism, and then also Buddhist traditions that come out of South Asia all together in one building. Because they're in different countries, they operate in different languages. But he points out, in the South, there are relatively few Buddhists, and they have to band together. And so what they do is together they have this meditation center, and they don't all just come in on a shift like, okay, we're going to do this practice, now we leave. The membership of these different groups is actually overlapping. So some people do Zen and Tibetan meditation in the same place. And this, I think, is interesting. It hasn't happened in Asia, but it's happening here. And now I'm on to number 4, the question of identity. Are we having a problem? Okay, sorry. So this leads us to identity. In the West, we generally think of religious identity as a primary marker of identity, right? Religion is one of those things that when you're filling out a survey, you get one box, you get one blank. Now, this is beginning to change a little bit, especially as religious intermarriage becomes more and more common, and some people articulate hybrid identities. But in general, the pre-modern West is still very much with us, and that legacy is an expectation that religious identity is exclusive, and there still is, I think, in the West, profound discomfort with people who straddle boundaries, who try to combine different traditions. Now, Merton didn't live to finish his Asian journey. And he didn't live to see the journals that he kept on that journey published. But after they were published, some Catholics were extremely uncomfortable with his level of involvement with Buddhism. And I want to look at one dream that he reported. Last night I dreamt I was temporarily back at Gethsemane. I was dressed in a Buddhist monk's habit, but with more black and red and gold, a Zen habit in more color, more Tibetan than Zen. I met some women in the corridor, visitors and students of Asian religion, to whom I was explaining that I was a kind of a Zen monk and Gelugpa together when I woke up. So a mixture of, so he's in a Catholic place, he's in a Trappist place, but he's wearing robes that are both Japanese Zen and Tibetan Gelugpa. Now, he also told somebody, he didn't write this down, but somebody who is sort of serving as his secretary on the trip said, a Benedictine monk, said that Thomas had said to him, I want to become as good a Buddhist as I can. Now, as I said, some of these comments have made some Catholics really uncomfortable, and some friends of Merton have responded by saying that Merton never had any intention of leaving the church, that in fact he had celebrated the Mass in Bangkok just 2 days before he died. For our purposes, what's really interesting is that Merton seems to have had the sense that he could be a good Buddhist and a Catholic monk. He didn't seem to think that talking to Buddhist teachers and doing Buddhist practices and reading Buddhist texts would undermine his Catholic identity. And this, I think, is kind of predictive of the development of interfaith dialogue, where you can be committed to a particular tradition and your commitment to that can actually deepen through discussion with others. The Buddhist tradition offers itself up to this kind of contact especially easily because of that kind of quasi-empirical attitude I mentioned earlier, this attitude of, well, try it. If it has results, good. You judge by your own experience. It's also the fact that meditation is often regarded by people as just a technique that you can kind of surgically remove from Buddhism or Hinduism and then introduce to another tradition. Also, you really have to remember, I think this is one of the most important things when one is thinking about Buddhism and Hinduism as compared to the monotheistic religions, is that Buddhists and Hindus, and Jains for that matter, they think in terms of multiple lifetimes. They're not thinking about you've got to get it right in this lifetime, right? It's not do or die. It's do and die and reborn and do and die and reborn and do. And that's if you're lucky that you manage to stay in what they call a precious human life, lifetime after lifetime. So Buddhist teachers sometimes say to people, yes, whatever you're doing, you're Jewish, wonderful. You're an Episcopalian, wonderful. Great. Is it leading you to be moral? Wonderful. Because you know what? That creates merit, and you're going to have good rebirths. And maybe you'll be a Buddhist eventually, right? So it's a very tolerant attitude. It may also be a little bit patronizing. But there's this room to sort of let people do what they're doing if it has good effects in their lives. For Buddhism in the West, this has meant that when many people are involved, they don't identify fully with Buddhism, or they've developed hybrid identities. Some scholars call these people Buddhist sympathizers, which I think is kind of unfortunate language. It sounds like, I don't know, it doesn't sound good. But there's a scholar at the University of North Carolina who has a wonderful name, Thomas Tweed. Don't you love that? Professor Tweed. And Professor Tweed he's a wonderful scholar of American religion with a focus on Asian religions. And he has an amazing article called Who is a Buddhist? Nightstand Buddhists, and Other Creatures. And he coined this phrase, nightstand Buddhist, and by what that he means Americans who read books about Buddhism. They don't necessarily belong to a community, they don't necessarily meditate, but they keep books by Buddhists on their nightstand and they read them and it contributes to their well-being. My sense is that there are a whole lot of nightstand Buddhists, maybe even an especially high percentage in Vermont. And that means that when Pew Research Center goes out and asks Americans check a box, the number comes back as very low for Buddhists. It's just 0.7 Americans in the 2008 research, the Pew Research Survey. I think that 0.7 doesn't capture the quite widespread interest that happens sometimes beyond institutions. So, I flipped 2 pages and suddenly made myself very confused, but I'm back. Okay. So these are all things that I see present in Merton's life that I think are pretty typical or commonly found in the American encounter with Buddhism. And, but I want to go through a few more. And one of the things I can take up once I move beyond Merton is the fact that not all Westerners encountering Buddhism are really new to Buddhism. Some of them come from countries where, or their families come from countries where that's their cultural heritage. So I want to make sure that it's understood that I'm including those folks as well. So I want to quickly, and much more quickly than I've done so far, throw out a number of points of observations, and then we'll turn to questions and comments, and probably you got some good stories for me. So the appeal of the Buddhist tradition is different for different people. For some people, of course, it is that it is their home tradition. As immigrants to this country, it is their home tradition. And for people like that, the temple actually becomes something like an extended community center. It's where you make sure that your kids learn that language and learn the etiquette of that culture, even though they're actually going to school surrounded by people who only speak English or Spanish or what have you. So for some people, Buddhism is actually their home tradition that then includes language, ethnic identity, etc. There's a scholar named Sharon Su who's written a book about a Korean American Buddhist community in LA, and it's called Being Buddhist in a Christian World. And she's actually talking about the double layer of Christianity because so many Korean Americans are Christian, and they actually emigrate to the US at a higher rate than Buddhists from Korea. So Korean American Buddhists have all these Korean American Christians to contend with, aside from just the dominant culture being so heavily influenced by Christianity. And the way that Buddhist immigrants use their Buddhism as a marker of identity, and it's very similar to what we've seen in the past in American history with Jews and Catholics, where your religious center becomes so much more than a place of spiritual solace. It also becomes the place where you spend a lot of your free time, where your activities are happening. And I just want to mention one sad element to this story, and that is that after Pearl Harbor in 1941, when the FBI started investigating Japanese Americans, they started out by first doing surveillance of 3 kinds of Japanese Americans: martial arts teachers, Japanese language teachers, and Buddhist leaders. They were the first people. So Japaneseness and Buddhistness were brought together there. Secondly, earlier I emphasized that a rejection of authority is characteristic of the modern US, but the truth is that actually some people are drawn to Buddhism precisely because of the authority that it does offer. Sometimes teachers are very charismatic, sometimes they're very wise, and sometimes they can make claims about being connected to the tradition in a way that's really satisfying for people, that you really feel like you're encountering somebody who's grounded in the tradition, that you're not just getting it from a book. So the nightstand Buddhist might be very comfortable with that. Somebody else might want to actually have face-to-face contact with somebody who comes from the tradition or is well grounded in the tradition. A third characteristic I want to mention is that monasticism is very weak in American Buddhism. It is much less present. Americans, by and large, are not interested in a celibate life. So monasticism is weaker here than anywhere else that we see. But what we see is that traditionally monastic practices have been adapted to what people are beginning to call retreat Buddhism. That is, monastic practices get offered at retreat centers. So rather than having a monastery that's full of monks or nuns who practice a lot and occasionally the lay people visit, instead there's a small core of monks or nuns, or sometimes both, and lay people come in and do monastic things for a stretch of time. And sometimes they come repeatedly to do that and build up a real foundation. Fourthly, and this is very much a sign of the times in the US, there's an incredible emphasis in American Buddhists by and large on social justice. So Buddhists of various kinds are active in prisons, with the homeless. Some of the earliest hospices for people with HIV/AIDS were run by Zen monks, priests in San Francisco, people doing anti-war work, etc. My fifth characteristic, I told you I'd be going quickly. My fifth characteristic is that Americans bring into their Buddhist institutions some very American ideas about leadership and ethics. Americans aren't entirely comfortable with one person having so much power. So there have been some scandals with certain leaders, and Americans have worked out some systems where instead of someone becoming the leader of an institution forevermore, they'll put in term limits. The San Francisco Zen Center, which I just mentioned, had a very famous scandal. And afterwards, they said, you know what? Instead of one abbot, we're going to have two. We're going to have co-abbots. And so they now, it's like, does this sound American? Checks and balances? You know, you have somebody watching. Sixth point, and these are not in order of importance, they're just, this is the way I came up with them. Sixth, the prominence of women. Women are really prominent in American Buddhism as leaders. Now, it's not that there aren't leaders in Asian Buddhism who are women. There are. There's some amazing powerhouse women out there in Asian Buddhism. But in American Buddhism, it's just really striking how many leaders, teachers, administrators, scholars are women. And here's my seventh point, and this one is kind of unresolved for me. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. That is the coming together in the West of Buddhism, Buddhist practice, Buddhist ideas with therapy, psychotherapy. Incredible overlap. Surveys have shown, granted they're not the world's biggest surveys, but surveys have shown that people in the West who are psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, counselors have a far higher degree of contact with Buddhism than other people of similar background, similar level of education, but different profession. Now, that needs some study and some untangling. Obviously, Buddhism is an extremely psychological tradition, right? It's very much about the mind on some level. But I feel like that's a really interesting, exciting thing that's happening. Now, I'm going to conclude with just coming back to China, because I started with China, telling you that one of the reasons I'm so interested in this is because I study the adaptation of Buddhism to China and China to Buddhism. I see these processes as being very, very similar, that conscious and unconscious changes are being made to the tradition, right? You come to a new tradition or you encounter it with what you have, and so you consciously and unconsciously affect it. But that it also tells me that Buddhism can really be planted in the US, and I think is being planted in the US, just as it was in China, even though when it first came to China, it just seemed like the very strangest thing. There was one Confucian statesman who wrote a letter to the emperor and said, if the Buddha himself had come to the imperial court, I would have told you to tell him, like, be polite to him and then tell him to leave, right? And instead, the Chinese landscape is dotted with temples, and Chinese people, many of them can't imagine thinking about life without some Buddhist influence. That said, life moves more quickly now. We have more knowledge, more access to knowledge, more mobility. And so I think it's not exactly the same process. It's happening much more quickly, but there's some fascinating parallels there. And I'm just excited that I get to work on my historical material and at the same time watch this unfolding. I think I had one last slide I wanted to show you. No, that was the last one. So we'll go back to Dixie Dharma because that's so much fun. Okay, and now I think I just want to invite your comments, questions, stories, because I'm sure many of you have thoughts about this or experiences that would be helpful. So if anybody needs to go, don't worry, you're not going to hurt my feelings. But if anybody has questions, thoughts, stories, please let me know. You had a question? Oh, and a microphone. Great. Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I think you said earlier in your program that in China there's a significant number of conversions to Protestantism. And you mentioned that it wasn't necessarily the religion, but that there was this sort of I don't want to say misunderstanding.
Package
but
deal.
A package deal.
Yeah.
Can you unlayer that? Do
Sure.
you know if religion is really the driver, or is it really Western, is it capitalism,
Well,
wealth?
Yeah, I think that the thing is that it's, first of all, doing research in contemporary China, doing research on religion in contemporary China is not easy. There are constraints because of government surveillance. But the people who have done it, the people who have done extensive interviewing and ethnographic work in communities in the People's Republic of China, what they report is that not only do people seem to be deeply attracted to certain, beautiful ideals in Christianity itself and the teachings of Jesus, but that often they also see Christianity as deeply a deep cause of things they admire in the West, like democracy, like capitalism, like science. So they don't separate them. They see them as they read the Bible and see in it a push toward the things that the modern West now represents or is. And of course that's happening because people don't understand a long convoluted history in which these things are related. And I'm not saying they're not related, I just am saying it's complicated. So, yeah, so it's not, I don't think it's that they're saying I'll become a Christian because that's the way to be rich. I think it's the full range of things and that they're connected.
Yeah.
Does that help?
And they may be right to some extent, that Christianity was a strong part of the original founding fathers or brothers of
There's certainly,
States,
right.
and there are a lot of
There are definitely a lot of connections. It's just you've got both push-pull factors, right, in the rise of all these things. For science, for democracy, for capitalism, Christianity, I think, is providing both push and pull, right? It's because Christianity is complicated, like all these traditions, these big ones. Thank you. I teach a whole class about religion in modern China. It's one of my favorite classes because it's so exciting. Yeah.
First of all, as someone that is really interested in Buddhism and specifically Indian Buddhism, and not so much Chinese Buddhism, it was very refreshing to hear you make the distinction between what is East and what is West, because I think, too often we just slice the globe in half and that's that. So that was nice to hear you say that. As someone that's more knowledgeable on the Chinese side of Buddhism, what do you find ironic or challenging about the contemporary Chinese policy towards Tibet and Buddhism within China?
Right. The Chinese government's attitude, the PRC government's attitude towards Tibetan Buddhism is so inexplicably contradictory that it blows one's mind. That on the one hand, there's this long history of suppression, also a long history of trying to use Tibetan Buddhist leaders as puppets, right? And that actually is connected to a longer Chinese state use of religious leaders. But at the same time, I mean, really what's on my mind right now is that the Dalai Lama is elderly and his health is not great. And he's been sending signals very clearly that he will be making predictions he will be announcing whether or not he's going to reincarnate. Because he has a choice, it's voluntary for him, not for the rest of us. According to Buddhists, if I can speak for myself, I'm in samsara, I don't choose. But he's supposed to be able to choose whether to come back or not. And he can choose not to. Or he can make it very clear, he can make a prediction that he will not be reincarnating anywhere where the Chinese government can touch that child, which would be very smart because bad things have happened to reincarnate lamas.
Panchen Lama. Yeah.
Right. So, but meantime, here's the really, really crazy thing is that the Chinese government keeps making statements about how it's their prerogative to validate the choice of reincarnate lamas. And you're just like, because you're just like, I think isn't Marx buried in London? And he's just like, in his grave, like, okay, a communist government claiming that it can validate spiritual rebirth, right? So it's absolutely crazy. Another factor to throw in there is that Tibetan Buddhism is very popular in China right now. It's increasing. There's always been a kind of, not always, there have been waves of elite interest in Tibetan Buddhism in China, but now educated people generally, and they actually have this sense that Tibetan Buddhist teachers they're like the real deal, whereas our own Chinese Buddhist teachers are kind of like blah. And I've had these conversations with people, over tea, where they're like, "Oh, let me tell you about my favorite Dharma teacher," and they pull up the website and they're like, "Listen to him," and I'm like, "Oh, I was expecting it to be in Chinese." And it's in Tibetan with Chinese translation, So there's this real vogue or fashion right now of Tibetan Buddhism in China. I don't know whether that's going to hold, but the fact that that's going on at the same time that people don't really have religious freedom in Tibet. That said, I do have to always say Chinese people don't have full religious freedom either, right? Like, you have to see it as part of a spectrum. I'm not saying that Tibetans haven't suffered terribly, but Chinese people have also not had freedom of religion. So, other questions, thoughts, stories? Yeah.
I'm just curious. You mentioned that the Catholic Church was nervous about his visit, Thomas Merton's visit to the East and so on. Do you have a sense that the further Thomas Merton grew within the context of Catholicism or in Christianity, that the closer he saw the relationship between Buddhism and Christian mysticism?
And see, there are many reasons that his death at 53 was a tragedy, but part of it is that we don't know I really can't predict how that trajectory was going to play out. I can say, and I showed you a few images where it's like he's happily spending time with these people who've also, as modern people, chosen to be monastic. And he clearly feels this deep fellowship with Thich Nhat Hanh, with the Dalai Lama. D.T. Suzuki wasn't actually a monk, but he had this deep sense of fellowship with these other people, even though if you really quiz them about it, of course their doctrine is different, what they really believe about how the world works is different, but the way they're choosing to live their lives is so similar that I think they had more in common with each other than they necessarily did with the ordinary person on the street who was living that alienated, materialistic life, whether in Tokyo or Bangkok or New York. How that ultimately would play out, I don't know. I honestly think that the Catholic Church really can only bend so far when it comes to these things, in part because of its centralized nature, where you do have the Vatican making statements that are supposed to hold for everybody. Although the current Pope is definitely trying to encourage a little bit more decentralization, but I think one comes up against a limit. That said, I do know a Canadian monk who lives in Korea, and rather than wearing his Catholic robes, he wears Buddhist robes, and he does Zen meditation. He actually teaches, he has a PhD in Buddhist studies, and he's a Catholic monk. And he seems to be doing fine. Like, nobody's excommunicated him, right? So I think part of it is this idea of people having ideas of truth that can stretch to make room for the other without it being a rivalry. So I also think that part of what Merton and maybe some other people do is they adopt what actually is a very, very common attitude in East Asia, which is to say religion is medicine. There's no one tradition that can cure all your ills. So in China, people used to say, at the office, Confucian. At home, Buddhist. At the office, Confucian. At home, Taoist. Or Buddhist and Taoist, right? So it's not that hard to then weave in another source of spiritual nourishment, so to speak. But it makes a lot of people who belong to monotheistic traditions really uncomfortable because those boundaries have been so important in monotheism, right? That we call them, the very idea that we call religions creeds, right? Creed means statement of belief, right? But not all religions are organized around a statement of belief. So that leaves you some room to welcome other things in. Of course, you can see why defenders of the faith might be really uncomfortable with that. In fact, not the current Pope and not the Pope, yes, the previous Pope, the retired Pope. He kind of represents the opposite pole, like the no, 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 no. And in fact, I didn't mention this, but Merton had to really fight to go on that Asian trip. He had wanted to go for a long time, and he wasn't allowed until finally he got permission. And he had a lot of clout. He was bringing money in. Aside from prestige, and people were actually reading the Seven-Story Mountain and his other books, and they were becoming monks and nuns, which in mid-century US, that was good, right? And he was bringing in money. All of the money from Seven-Story Mountain went to the abbey or went to the church. So he had a lot of clout, and he still was bound by his vow of obedience, and so he couldn't go to Asia until he was given permission. So that was sort of a rambling answer, for which I apologize. But other thoughts or questions? I hope I'm not missing anybody in the far back. No? Yes?
There are two sects in Buddhism, Hinayana and Mahayana, two sects. Could you please shed some light on the differences in thoughts between these two groups, Hinayana and Mahayana, two sects?
Right. Those of us who study Buddhism as a whole generally actually identify three groups. So, and the first group is what we find in South Asia. It grows out of the earliest Buddhism. It's what we find in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and it stays very close to the earliest teachings of the Buddha. The second group, Mahayana, arrives on the scene a couple hundred years after the life of the Buddha, and it actually introduces a whole new body of literature, and they're actually the ones who call the other group Hinayana. But scholars try to avoid the term Hinayana because it's actually an insult. So people in South Asia do not call themselves Hinayana, they call themselves Theravada, which means the school of the elders. Mahayana means the great vehicle, and they called people Hinayana, which means little vehicle, lesser vehicle. So scholars try to avoid that term. And Mahayana, it's complicated, but it introduces a whole new body of literature and a new understanding of what one's goal should be as a Buddhist. Not that one should just reach for awakening as an individual, but that one should actually strive to become a Buddha, that all beings should become Buddhas and can become Buddhas. And then after the Mahayana, we then have the rise of what's called Vajrayana, but in the West, most people know it as Tantra. There's also versions of Hinduism that are called Tantra, and what it does is it builds on Mahayana, it accepts pretty much all of Mahayana philosophy, and then it adds to it techniques to bring rapid awakening. And that's where we get some of the more wild practices, either done symbolically or actually done, mostly done symbolically. And it's funny that I'm gesturing because actually to do them symbolically is called the right-hand way. To do them actually, to do transgressive things that'll help you reach beyond and reach non-duality is called the left-hand way, which translates very well as the sinister way. But it's not meant to be sinister. But it actually takes me a whole semester to move through all three of those movements. But very basically, it's three different movements that arise successively in Buddhist history and have their own bodies of literature. And they've spread themselves out on the map, so they're mostly in different countries. But of course, here in the US, you've got it all. I mean, in Vermont, we don't have all of it. We've got two of the three here. But we would just have to hop in our cars and drive to Montreal, and we could very quickly find representatives of all of them. So, any other? Yes?
You mentioned Sufism, and the spread of Islam often was led by Sufis who have this charismatic techniques that are very appealing. You mentioned charismatic Protestantism is now surging in China right now. Often new religions are led by these charismatic traditions. How does that apply to the Buddhist growth in the U.S.?
Buddhism Buddhists tend to respond to a very quiet kind of charisma, because the ideal in Buddhism is a person who's very calm and still and wise. Now, could that same person also be very playful and joyful? And prime example there would be the Dalai Lama, who just he's always laughing and making people laugh. And yet he's still, I think many people respond to him by feeling like his joy and his laughter comes from sort of a deep well of stillness or something. While there definitely are some teachers who are characterized as charismatic, and some people are very drawn to that, because Buddhism doesn't actually celebrate emotion in the same way as some other traditions do, the charisma doesn't express itself in kind of getting people riled up. Instead, it's about trying to get people to overcome complacency and practice really hard. And I won't name any names, but I know somebody who said to me, he was telling me about his Zen center. And I said, well, tell me about it. I'm not an ethnographer, but I'll love to talk to people about these things. And he said, oh, my teacher, she's like this, she's like that. And he said, best of all, she's not charismatic. And to him, that was a selling point. He was like, she just is what she is. She's not selling herself. She's not performing. She's just being this kind of still voice of wisdom for him that he believed came out of all of her meditative practice. And I have to say, probably the most charismatic figures are the people who sometimes are on that side of transgressive wisdom, the crazy wisdom, who do things that break the rules, and then their followers are stuck with the question, are they breaking the rules to teach us something, or are they just breaking the rules? Some communities have ended up being able to make sense of it, others haven't. With that I could name names, but I think we're actually past time, but should I? Okay, one more question, and then of course I can linger for a little bit afterwards if people had questions, if there are questions. Or stories. No. Well, can I ask a question then? I want to do a poll of hands, and you can raise your hand for more than one thing. Did you come for Thomas Merton? A few people, yeah, some people. Did you come for Buddhism? Yeah, so there's some overlap there, right? Did you come for meditation? Some people, yeah. My students at Middlebury College are always very disappointed when I say I'm not qualified to teach you meditation. Sorry, I can do history, I can do philosophy, but I am not actually a meditation teacher. Yes?
The term mindfulness
Mm-hmm.
seems to be very prominent.
It sure is.
Is it related in any way to these religions? Or?
Very much so. So mindfulness usually applies to a very particular kind of Buddhist meditation that grows out of the South Asian tradition. So some of the most prominent mindfulness teachers come from Burma and Thailand. You can find it in other traditions, but what's happened is that it's a basic technique of observing your own mind and kind of being alone with yourself and attending to your own mind, which for Buddhists believe that this has incredible benefit, that you start to figure out who you really are and you start to control your own emotions, etc., and see through, to see that a lot of one's agitation day to day and unhappiness day to day is actually, you've made it yourself. But what's happened is that idea has, and I mentioned this, that this is a form of meditation that's sort of been extracted from a Buddhist or religious context and been introduced as simply a psychological technique. And the pioneer of this is a guy named John Kabat-Zinn. You probably have some of his books on your shelves. But a lot of other people have taken it up, and now there are people doing workshops and introducing it right, left, and center as something that you don't have to have any particular belief. You don't have to do anything except follow the instructions. But it doesn't require belief in karma, reincarnation, the Buddha, anything. No, you just do this technique and it's going to be good for you. And the psychologists and the neuroscientists are churning out study after study in which they establish that indeed, for most people, not everybody, but for most people, it does produce some more calmness, some more perspective. This comes as a particular shock, I think, to younger people who are especially attached to their technology, so that they're really never alone with their minds. I think those of us who are older are not so unfamiliar with the idea of actually thinking our thoughts and not, being inundated by something. But I have a colleague at the college who makes some students, in pursuit of mindfulness, she makes the students, as a sort of an experiment, go on a digital fast, where they're not allowed to do any social media or any of that, and then report on it. I should say one thing that's come out, though, is that for some people, mindfulness meditation is not just uncomfortable, but actively awful. There are some people who have really horrible experiences in meditation, and that doesn't get talked about. I think it's only a small minority, but when I hear people go on and on about the benefits of mindfulness, I feel like it needs to be acknowledged that some people have really scary, awful experiences in meditation, and that this is strong stuff. This can be really strong stuff, and it should be entered into with some care, right? I could go on, but I'd sort of like, note of warning, your mileage may vary. So, and I feel like I should let you go. If anybody wants to talk to me, I can linger for a little bit, and have a good night.